atheists need to be consistent. And at the moment, they are not. What they do is they claim two different things which do not make any sense because they are logically incompatible. They claim they are skeptics. They are free thinkers. They follow reason. They question everything. They do not take anything for granted. And at the same time, they do take things for granted. They take Richard Dawkins as an authority. That's taken for granted. They take what he says in his books, in his writings about Darwinism, getting rid of the idea of God. They take that for granted. But I'm going to give them clear evidence why they shouldn't take him for granted, even though a priori they shouldn't be doing that anyway, because their whole narrative is we're going to question everybody. But they don't obviously question the people that happen to fall in line with their worldview. Anyway, so when it comes to Führer Richard Dawkins, he's been since the 1980s maintaining a narrative. In The Blind Watchmaker, he says, Darwin allowed it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And from the 1980s all the way to the present day, in all of his books, including his landmark book, The God Delusion, that same narrative is there. Darwinism gets rid of the idea of design. Darwinism explains away design. Darwinism explains away God. And therefore he tries to apply that to the universe, and then he basically concludes, therefore God almost certainly doesn't exist. That is the central argument of the God Delusion. That's the basic idea. So now that we have this particular claim of his, let's see if philosophers of biology actually agree with him on this. If they don't agree, then there's a clear contradiction. And you guys need to show why he is right and they are wrong. Now, you can't just use the argument, oh, he's so popular. No, his popularity doesn't really work. Them not being known also doesn't work, because you have to look at the logic here. So although he's maintained this narrative that, look, science is explaining biological design without the need for God, therefore there's no God, just look at what a prominent philosopher of biology says about this topic. Elliot Sober, who is an atheist, admits that science, even though it can explain something without invoking God, that doesn't mean there is no God. I want to actually read out exactly what he said. But the inference from science can explain phenomena X without invoking the existence of God to God does not exist is shaky. It is true that science can explain why gold melts at a certain temperature without postulating the existence of dinosaurs. But that isn't evidence that there were no dinosaurs. We need to attend to Monad's good advice. Any confusion between the ideas suggested by science and science itself must be carefully avoided. Newtonian theory and Darwinian theory suggest to some people that there is no God. However, this is not what these theories say. It is a philosophical interpretation of those theories, one whose justification requires additional premises. So this false marriage, this forced marriage between atheism and Darwinism is something which has to be exposed. You can't just simply go from, oh yeah, this thing is being explained biologically without the invocation of God, therefore there is no God. And this idea, although it's so simple, right? Simpletons, feeble-minded atheists, they lap it up, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. But when you look at the philosophy of science, you start to realize none of these things make sense. So even though this is Dawkins' central argument, the central argument is fallacious. It's no wonder why Michael Ruse, an atheist, philosopher of science, a hardcore Darwinian, someone who defends Darwinism, says that the God delusion makes him embarrassed to be an atheist. Now I want you to think about that. Even if you don't, I know atheists have this selective memory, right? They don't like listening to what disagrees with them. But just keep two things in mind. You have a person that you love, respect, worship, Richard Dawkins, who writes The God Delusion, and it becomes a bestseller, translated in many different languages, and it's supposed to be landmark and whatnot. And then you have Michael Ruse, a respected academic who's written many books on Darwinism, published by major universities across the world. He is probably the most well-known philosopher of science alive today. And he says, when I read The God Delusion, it makes me embarrassed to be an atheist. You guys need to think about this. You guys, even if you don't agree with Elliot Sober, you guys need to think, why is Richard Dawkins saying things which philosophers of science, philosophers of biology do not say? Why are they saying things different to what he is saying? What's going on? And there's a very simple explanation for this, as Michael Roos points out. Dawkins is terrible at philosophy and theology. He doesn't understand the logic of argumentation. He doesn't understand this thing and this thing added together does not lead to this. Me buying an apple from a market and also a banana from the market doesn't mean I can go to the moon. These two things are completely unlinked. So what we need to do, atheists, is this. That narrative of yours, we are free thinkers, we are rational people, we are people who question everything, we're willing to follow the evidence wherever it goes, even if it disagrees with our worldview, which is nonsense, by the way. Anyway, this narrative of yours, just take 1% of that skepticism that you apply to God. When it comes to God, you ask a million questions. No problem. We can answer those. But you have a million questions. God doesn't make sense because of this. God's too complex. God this, God that, right? Anthropic principle. Add a little bit of that 1% of skepticism to the building of Darwinism, and you will see it crumble before your very eyes. And all you need for that is a little bit of sincerity. That's all you need. And you'll start to realize that this particular theory is not something which I would say is unscientific, because it's the best naturalistic explanation at the moment from a purely naturalistic point of view. If you get rid of methodological naturalism, it would be a different ballgame. However, from the perspective of, is it true? Literally, you will see it is not the case at all. And this man, the Führer, Richard Dawkins, he has been misleading you. And no wonder why. No wonder why a prestigious scientist like E.O. Wilson, who is the father of sociobiology, who is one of the most well-known biologists in the world today, he considers Richard Dawkins not even a scientist. He considers him to be a science journalist. So what you guys need to do, be consistent. Don't be incoherent. Don't contradict your own principles. If your principles are that of skepticism, then apply a little bit. Just be generous. Apply a little bit of that skepticism to Darwinism, and you will see that it is actually a delusion.